In this last lecture in our week of talking about emotion and motivation, I want to talk about some of the more powerful motivators that can drive human behavior. Hunger is one of the most important primary drives. Now, where do you think this drive to eat comes from? Most people think it originates in the stomach, so pointing to one's stomach is a pretty universal sign of hunger. It's often the first thing a little kid will do to indicate that they're hungry. But really, the stomach doesn't have all that much to do with it. The brain is much more influential than the stomach as a command center and control center for regulating food cravings. Physiologically, there's a lot that goes into eating. So an empty stomach will contract, followed by hunger pangs or that growling sensation. Chemical messages are then sent to the brain informing us that, hey, we're hungry, eat something. At the same time, an empty stomach means that our blood glucose levels are going to drop, prompting the pancreas and the liver to generate those chemical signs that indicate hunger, those hunger pangs. Now, there's a limit to how much food we can eat. Eventually, your stomach is going to fill up. This is known as satiation. You're now full and satisfied, so there's no longer a need to eat, prompting us to stop eating. Hopefully, sometimes when you're eating something really delicious, you might eat past the point of satiation. As with the initiation of eating behaviors, there's a lot of physiological mechanisms that go into satiation as well. So blood glucose levels will increase, the pancreas and liver will send signals to shut off hunger and eating. Hey, we're full, we're good down here, no more food needed. And ultimately, activity in the brain determines whether or not we engage in this feeding behavior. Now, our eating behaviors are directly related to weight gain and obesity. So our body weight is affected by a number of factors, such as gene-environment interactions and the number of calories consumed versus the number burned in daily activity. Unsurprisingly, if our caloric intake exceeds our caloric usage, our bodies are going to have all this extra energy that it's not sure what to do with, so it stores it in the form of fat. And the reverse is also true. If we consume fewer calories than we burn off, the stored fat becomes converted to energy. How much energy we expend is obviously affected by our levels of activity, but also to something called metabolic rate. A person's metabolic rate is the amount of energy that's expended in a given period of time, and there is tremendous individual variation in our metabolic rates. Ever hear somebody talk about having a high or low metabolism? Well, people with those high rates of metabolism can burn off calories much more easily than those with lower rates of metabolism. Now, everyone's weight fluctuates from time to time. Ever notice that your jeans might get a little tight around the holidays with all the extra eating and sweets and snacks and cookies? But generally, these are not major wild fluctuations. Most people's weights go back and forth within a fairly narrow margin. Now, of course, the obvious exception is when people experience a major life change, such as an injury that prevents exercise or switching to a different dietary plan, like an Atkins type style or something like that. Now, the set point theory is the idea that we all have a set point to which we typically return. So, in other words, when we drop below our genetically programmed set point, our appetite might increase and our metabolism might decrease to help us gain back that weight to get us back to that set point. You can sort of think of this as a form of homeostasis or a desire to get back to that predetermined set point or balance. So this may help to explain why some people are just always seem to be in great shape, while others have to struggle to maintain a healthy weight. Might be because they have different set points. Now, for some people, healthy eating is a struggle. This is known as eating disorders. Eating disorders are disproportionately found in adolescent girls, but that doesn't mean that they can't occur in other genders or age ranges. So let's talk a little bit about some of the more common ones, and we'll revisit this again when we get to psychological disorders towards the end of this semester. So anorexia is characterized by starving oneself due to the fear of getting fat. Those with this disorder have an extremely distorted body image and often lose 25 to 50% of their body weight, so it is quite serious. While anorexia primarily affects teenage girls, 10 to 15 of anorexia cases are comprised of boys, often many of whom are a sexual minority who may struggle with their strong or bulky body. A major barrier to treating anorexia is denial. So those who have it are usually have an extremely distorted sense of their own body. They may look in a mirror and instead of the skeletal reality that the rest of the world sees, they see a grossly overweight person. Anorexia is associated with things like severe nutrition, physical complications, and can even lead to death in extreme cases. Bulimia is characterized by binge eating followed by compensatory efforts to avoid weight gain, such as deliberate vomiting or purging with laxatives or excessive exercise or fasting following the binge. Those with bulimia often experience depression, guilt, and suicidal thoughts associated with the binge eating. Again, it's primarily found in girls, although sexual minority boys are often vulnerable. Bulimia is actually more common than anorexia and affects 2 to 4% of teenage girls. Anorexia and bulimia are both heritable, so this means that there are strong genetic links, and bulimia is also associated with being overweight, early impulsivity, sensation-seeking tendencies, and having parents with a disengaged parenting style. Bulimia is easier to treat than anorexia because typically individuals are aware that there's a problem and want that help, whereas in anorexia, we see that sense of denial. Binge eating disorder is similar to bulimia in that they engage in the binge eating, but this time there is not the compensatory purging that characterizes bulimia. So unsurprisingly, binge eating disorder typically leads to obesity and is associated with severe distress, suicidal thoughts, and many social adjustment difficulties. So we've talked about hunger as a motivation, but now I want to switch gears and talk about another major motivator, which is love and sex. Directly related is interpersonal attraction, or that feeling of chemistry or connectedness to another individual. Attraction is influenced by a number of social factors, such as proximity or physical nearness, and repeated exposure increases perceptions of another's attractiveness. Similarly, the amount of things that we have in common with others is also related to attraction. So we're more likely to befriend, date, and marry people who are similar to us than those who are different. Sort of flies in the face of that whole opposites attract thing. Reciprocity is the rule of give and take, which is also a predictor of attraction. So the idea that mutual disclosure of intimate topics can promote feelings of intimacy and attraction. And finally, the level of physical attraction matters as well, especially in the peer literature on social status. There's quite a bit of research showing that physically attractive people tend to be more popular than physically unattractive people. And there's actually quite a bit of science that goes into what we find attractive. So let's talk about that next. Is beauty really in the eyes of the beholder? Sure, that's true on a smaller level. We all think that our partner is the most attractive person in the world. But on a much broader level, there are some universal standards of attractiveness. One is facial preference. So the more average a face is in terms of the size and proportion of facial features, the more attractive it tends to be rated. And this holds up across cultures. Another is body shape. There are certain ideal social images of things like hip to waist ratios that are universally viewed as attractive. So studies have found that men tend to prefer a hip to waist ratio around 0.7, but females like higher ones. And there's some cultural differences in preference for things like body size, but overall these ideals hold up. And sure, there's some individual differences in what we prefer, but as a rule, human attractiveness is pretty predictable. There's also some sex differences in attraction. So while physical attraction is important to both men and women, it tends to be especially important to men. And this holds true across cultures. So while the amount of weight we place on physical attraction varied across countries and cultures, overall, men tend to weigh physical attractiveness as more important than women do. Males will place more emphasis on looks and having a younger mate who appears more fertile, while women tend to prefer mates who are more mature and have more resources. And so these ideas are heavily rooted in evolutionary theory. Although both sexes tend to place a premium on factors like intelligence, dependability, and kindness. There's a few different theories to explain why we find certain things attracted. So, as I mentioned, evolutionary models are rooted in the need for reproduction. Men are capable of reproducing far more than women are, so their goal is to seek out a partner with the best chance of successfully producing offspring. For example, women who are young, have broad hips, and who appear to be fertile, sort of that sowing wild oats mindset. On the other hand, women are much more invested in the raising of offspring since they have the physical task of carrying a child for 9 months and then giving birth. So women have to be more choosy in their sexual partners, often preferring a strong and dominant partner who can provide resources for them and their child, like safety and food and shelter. Now, again, this isn't one evolutionary perspective, and much of this doesn't hold up today. We know that women are strong and independent and can provide for themselves. However, evolutionary preferences are deeply ingrained and likely do influence at least what we find attractive. Another explanation is social role theory, which is the idea that biological variables play a role in men and women's preference by constraining the roles they adopt. So, since men are physically larger and stronger than women, they've adopted the role of provider, while women's biological ability to bear children may result in their role as child caretaker. Sexual desire or libido is influenced by many factors: genes, biology, social and cultural factors, etc. Neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine appear to play a role. So, serotonin is negatively associated with sexual desire, while variations in genes related to dopamine transmission were positively associated with reports of sexual desire and arousal. In other words, genes may be at least partially related to things like promiscuity or infidelity. Unsurprisingly, there are some gender differences in human behaviors. So there's a common myth that men are more sex-driven than women. There may actually be some empirical support to this. Studies have found that men desire sex more often and experience more sexual arousal compared to women. Makes sense if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, like we just discussed. However, women have plenty of sexual motivation of their own, and women experience more variability in the sex drives throughout their lives and tend to be more fluid than men in their sexual orientation. Norms of gender may help to explain these differences. Men are socialized to be assertive and aggressive, while women are socialized to hide their desires and not express themselves as fully. Women are also taught that wanting sex makes them promiscuous, which has created this social phenomenon of women as the sexual gatekeepers who must keep the men at bay. Sort of the idea of the sexual double standard. She's a slut, he's a stud. But these norms can be dangerous, particularly when considering victim blaming in situations of sexual violence. Some of the early studies of the physiology of sexual responding hardly seem all that enticing. Did anyone watch the Showtime original Masters of Sex? It was based on the work of husband and wife team William Masters and Virginia Johnson, who conducted pioneering work on sexual desire and sexual responding. By that, I mean they literally brought couples into a lab and hooked them up to equipment to monitor physical changes during sexual activity. Their research indicated that there's a clear sexual response cycle, identical for men and women, at least in the phases. And there are 4 phases. So the excitement phase, in which people experience the physiological changes associated with sexual pleasure, like penile erection in men and vaginal swelling and lubrication in women. During the plateau phase, sexual tension builds, and if it continues, it ultimately leads to the 3rd phase, orgasm or climax, which is marked by involuntary contractions in the muscles of genitals in both men and women. The resolution phase following orgasms is associated with feelings of relaxation and a sense of well-being. And sex is a strong motivator, particularly for teenagers whose hormones have recently been activated. So think about how people might engage in a series of behaviors in order to gain access to sexual activity, such as going to bars, dating, etc. So I hope you remember earlier when we talked about gender identity, and I said it was completely different from sexual orientation. Gender orientation is your sense of maleness or femaleness and how you present that to the world. But sexuality is who you feel sexually attracted to. One more distinction, sexual orientation, or who you're attracted to, is not the same as sexual activity, or who you actually engage in sexual activity with. There are plenty of people who may be sexually attracted to one sex, but don't actually engage in sex with them for whatever reason. Homosexual behavior, or attraction to someone of the same sex as oneself, has been documented in over 450 species. So we don't only see homosexual behavior in humans. Approximately 2.8% of males and 1.4% of females identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, although those numbers are likely vastly underestimated because people may not be out or sharing their sexual orientation with the world. The APA has affirmed, or the American Psychological Association has affirmed, that they view same-sex attraction as a normal variation of human sexuality and do not support the use of therapy to attempt changing orientations. And there, in fact, is no evidence to suggest that sexual orientation is a choice or anything that can be changed. Initially, some therapy did attempt to alter sexual orientation, but we no longer view that as a viable or ethical option. To be clear, there is no empirical evidence whatsoever that sexual orientation is something we choose. And the APA, the governing body in the field of psychology, considers same-sex attraction as entirely normal. In fact, evidence from twin studies show that genes influence sexual orientation. For male homosexuality, there's a 52% concordance rate in identical twins compared to 22% in fraternal twins, suggesting a genetic component to sexual orientation. But remember, nature and nurture are always involved, and Behm's exotic becomes erotic theory recognizes the interplay of nature and nurture. So non-conforming children may feel different and strange from their peers, thus perceiving their same-sex peers as an unfamiliar and exotic choice. There's also a number of hormonal influences of testosterone that affect temperament and set the stage for deviation from traditional sexual orientation later in life. Having older brothers increases the odds of male homosexuality. So for each older brother you have, your odds of being homosexual increase by 33%. Scientists are not positive why this is, but it is likely something to do with the role of the male fetus in the mother's body. It actually changes the makeup of the mother's body so that her immune system might begin to develop more male antibodies that affect sexual differentiation in the brain of the fetus. Kind of cool, right? There are possible influence reasons. Let's leave that there. Intertwined with attraction and sex is love. Love is arguably an extremely strong motivator. Ever hear the expression, we do crazy things when we're in love? Oops, I forgot to change the slide. So what is love and how do we define it? Some people think of love as physical passion, where others think of it as long-lasting affection. Some people believe in love at first sight, and others think that it takes years to develop. One prevailing theory was developed by Robert Sternberg, who created what's known as the triangular theory of love. So according to this theory, love is made up of three components: intimacy, passion, or commitment, which form the three corners of Sternberg's triangle. Passion involves feelings and desires that lead to physical attraction, romance, and sexual attraction. Intimacy is the emotional component, so that warm trust and affection. Commitment is the cognitive component. So this involves feelings that lead a person to remain with someone and move towards shared goals. Now, we can combine these three different types of love. And based on his triangle, Sternberg identified 8 types of love, or the combinations. So if you combine passion with intimacy, you get romantic love. If you combine intimacy with commitment, you get companionate love. And all three together, the total ultimate form of love, is what Sternberg called consummate love, which is made up of all three components and is the total form of love. It represents an ideal relationship. Couples who experience this kind of love tend to have great sex several years into their relationship. They can't imagine themselves with anyone else or see themselves truly happy without their partners. They manage to overcome differences and face stressors together. So obviously this is the ideal. Whether or not couples are able to reach this level of love depends on a wide range of factors, both individually and within the couple. So you might be thinking that I said there were 8 types of love, but that's only 7. The final one is non-love or empty love, which is when you don't have any of these. It might be a relationship with an acquaintance and is characterized by a complete absence of intimacy, passion, and commitment. The quiz code for this week is piano, all lowercase letters. The way we experience love differs across many lines, one of which is culture. In Western cultures, passion and respect are viewed as the basis for marriage, but there's also a sense of independence required, or the idea that in order to be part of a duo, you must first be whole within yourself. To that end, dependency is regarded as immature, clingy, or unpleasant. But in Eastern cultures, things like companionship, practical matters, and obligations to others serve the basis for choosing lifelong partners. Compared to Eastern cultures, dependency is viewed as a positive quality and a sign of interdependence, which is highly valued. There's also a higher prevalence of arranged marriages in Eastern cultures. So while Western cultures typically choose their own partners, Eastern cultures are much more likely to see arranged marriages as an intentional act of building love. And finally, at the risk of ending on a bummer note, let's talk about hatred, which can also be a very powerful motivator for engaging in some behaviors. Sternberg, the same guy who created the theory of love, also has some things to say about hate. Unsurprisingly, they are the negation of the 3 pieces of love: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Negation of intimacy is the idea that, yeah, I really just don't want to get close to this person. Negation of passion is, I really despise this person. And the negation of commitment is that you're determined to stop or harm this person. And combinations of these types lead to the idea of burning hatred. So it's sort of the flip side to the compassionate love, which is high on all 3 dimensions. But as we can learn to hate, we can also unlearn it, which may be particularly helpful in overcoming confirmation bias towards seeing only the negative aspects of a person or group, which we'll talk about in the next week when we cover social psychology. Recognizing that there's both good and bad in everyone can help us to overcome these. So I leave you with a quote from Harry Potter, with Sirius Black telling Harry, "The world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters. We've all got both light and dark inside us. What matters is the part we choose to act on. That's who we really are." Thanks, everyone. I will see you in the next module when we talk about social psychology.